The wind moved across the Wyoming plains like an old memory. It carried dust, silence, and a name, Tom Horn. Long after the frontier was gone, people still whispered about him. Some called him a hero. Others said he was a cold killer. But everyone agreed on one thing. Tom Horn was different. He was the kind of man who didn't just live through history, he made it. And in the end, it destroyed him. Tom Horn's story begins long before the headlines, long before the gallows creaked in Cheyenne. He was born in 1860 in a small log cabin in Missouri. His family was poor, not just poor in money, but poor in love and luck. His father was a hard man, one who believed that pain built character. Tom learned early that if he wanted kindness, he'd have to find it somewhere else. By 16, he had enough. He packed a small bag, took a horse, and left home without saying goodbye. He never looked back. That ride, through the forests, over the plains, into the great unknown, changed him. He didn't know it yet, but he was riding toward a life that would make him both famous and feared. Out west, Tom Horn discovered a new kind of freedom. It was a land where rules didn't mean much, where the strong survived and the weak were forgotten. He worked as a wrangler, a stage driver, a messenger, anything that kept him close to the land. He had a quiet strength that people noticed. He didn't talk much, but when he did, folks listened. He was tall, sharp-eyed, and confident, the kind of man you didn't want as an enemy, and he had one gift that would define him. He could track anything that moved. Horn could follow a set of footprints across miles of open desert and never lose the trail. He could read signs in the dirt like other men read books. That skill got him noticed by the U.S. Army. When the Apache Wars began, the Army needed scouts, men who could move through the wild country and find the enemy before the enemy found them. Tom Horn fit the part. He joined up as a civilian scout and interpreter. He rode with General Crook and later helped track the famous Apache leader Geronimo. It was dangerous work. He saw ambushes, long chases, and endless desert battles. But he never ran. He was brave, maybe too brave. The Army respected him, but the fighting changed him. He saw what men did to each other in the name of civilization. He saw villages burned, families broken, promises made and broken again. When Geronimo finally surrendered, Tom Horn wasn't the same man who had left Missouri. He was harder now, quieter, a man who understood that the world wasn't fair and never would be. After the wars, the West was still wild. There were bandits, rustlers, and killers in every canyon. Tom Horn needed work, and the famous Pinkerton National Detective Agency needed men like him. He became a Pinkerton, a professional manhunter. For a while, he walked on the right side of the law. He tracked bank robbers, train thieves, and murderers. He was good at it, too good. But the Pinkertons wanted detectives who followed orders. Tom Horn didn't. He believed in his own code. If a man did wrong, he should pay for it. Fast. He didn't wait for courts or trials. Justice to him was something you carried in a holster. It wasn't long before the Pinkertons let him go. He had become too dangerous, too unpredictable. But his reputation, that cold, steady, deadly reputation, had just begun to grow. By the 1890s, the cattle wars were tearing Wyoming apart. Rich ranchers were fighting poor settlers over land, water, and survival. And they needed someone who could protect their interests. Someone who wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty. They found Tom Horn. He became what they called a range detective. It sounded official, but everyone knew the truth. Horn was a hired gun. If a rancher's cattle went missing, Horn would find the thief. And if the thief didn't give them back, he never came back at all. People whispered about him. Stories spread across the frontier. About the cowboy who could track you from a single print, who could shoot a coin from 50 yards, who never missed. Some said he was a hero cleaning up the West. Others said he was a monster in a cowboy hat. Tom Horn didn't care what they said. He had one rule. I never killed a man who didn't need killing. That's what folks remembered most about him. A sentence that sounded like justice and felt like a warning. But time was changing. The open range was closing. Lawmen, judges, and newspapers were spreading faster than tumbleweed. The world that made Tom Horn was disappearing. And a man like him couldn't last forever. The people he once protected, the ranchers, the lawmen, even his friends, would soon turn against him. All it would take was one shot, one mistake, one dead boy in the wrong place at the wrong time. That's where this story leads. to the hills of Wyoming, to a boy named Willie Nickel, and to the day justice decided to hang its own executioner. Because when the West finally ended, Tom Horn was standing at the edge, the last cowboy, the last gunman, the ghost of a world that could never come back. Before Tom Horn became a name that echoed through the West, he was just a boy, poor, lonely, and angry at the world. He was born on November 21st, 1860, in a rough log cabin in Scotland County, Missouri. His parents, Thomas Horn Sr. and Mary Ann Maricha, were hard-working farmers, the kind who measured a man's worth by the calluses on his hands. Life on the Horn farm was not kind. Every day was a fight, against hunger, drought, and each other. Tom was the fifth of 12 children. That meant he learned early how to be invisible. He wasn't the oldest, not the youngest, just one more mouth to feed. His father was a strict religious man who ruled the house like a soldier commands a camp. He believed that beating the weakness out of his children was the same thing as raising them right. But Tom wasn't like the others. He had something inside him, a spark, a restlessness. He couldn't stand to be small or afraid. When his father yelled, Tom didn't flinch. When he was told to stay, he dreamed of leaving. At school, Tom didn't last long. He hated sitting still. He wanted to do, not read. He wanted to see what was out there beyond the fields and fences. And there was a lot out there. Talk of cowboys, outlaws, gold, and a wild country that stretched forever. By the time he was 16, Tom Horn had decided. He was leaving. He didn't take much: a blanket, a pistol, and a small knife. One cold morning, before the sun had even touched the hills, he walked out the door and never came back. He didn't know where he was going, only that anywhere was better than home. That choice, simple, desperate, and brave, was the first step on a trail that would lead him across deserts, battlefields, and finally, to the gallows. The West in the late 1870s was not a place for the weak. It was wild, raw, and deadly beautiful. Every day was a gamble, against nature, against men, against luck. Tom started by working small jobs, wrangling horses, fixing fences, hauling freight. He had a strong back and a quiet way about him. People noticed that he didn't complain, didn't brag, didn't talk much at all, and when trouble came, he didn't scare easily. One story said he broke up a fight between two older cowboys who were twice his size. Another said he once tracked a lost calf for miles through rough country, and found it, half dead, because he refused to give up. That's what set him apart. He had something rare: focus. When Tom Horn wanted something, he found it. It was that gift, that stubbornness, that caught the eye of soldiers stationed in Arizona. The U.S. Army needed scouts, men who knew how to move through the wild lands of the Southwest. They didn't care about age or education. They cared about results. Horn could ride, shoot, and track like no one else. He could spot a trail where others saw only sand. He could tell the age of a footprint, the number of horses, and even guess who made them. By 18, Tom Horn was riding for the Army as a civilian scout. He had gone from farm boy to frontiersman. It was the first time in his life he felt like he belonged. The Apache Wars were raging. The deserts of Arizona and New Mexico were full of tension, blood, and dust. The Apache tribes, led by men like Geronimo, were fighting to keep their land. The U.S. Army wanted to take it. Horn was sent into that world, a translator, a tracker, and sometimes a soldier. He learned to speak Spanish and bits of Apache. He learned how to survive with almost nothing, how to find water, how to move quietly, how to disappear. But more than anything, he learned about death. He saw ambushes, massacres, and burnt-out villages. He saw the face of war up close, and it wasn't glorious. It was cruel, endless, and dirty. The boy who had run from Missouri had finally found adventure. But it wasn't the kind he had imagined. When Geronimo finally surrendered, Tom Horn was there. He helped negotiate, helped escort the Apache leaders to their final camps. And when it was done, he didn't celebrate. Something inside him had changed. He had seen too much killing to believe in heroes anymore. He had seen too much lying to believe in honor. The Army praised him as a brave scout, but Horn didn't stay. He had done his part, and now he was restless again. He drifted north to Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana, taking odd jobs, breaking horses, and chasing new horizons. But everywhere he went, people saw something in his eyes. That cold, distant look of a man who'd seen the edge of the world and wasn't afraid of it. Tom Horn was only in his 20s, but already he had lived 10 lives. He had left behind his family, his childhood, and even his innocence. The war had carved something into him, a belief that the world only respected power, that right and wrong were decided not in courts or churches, but out in the open, between a man and his gun. He wasn't an outlaw yet. He wasn't famous yet, but the road was already set. The boy born in dust had become a man made of iron, and the West, brutal, lawless, and changing fast, was waiting for him. The desert doesn't forgive. It burns, blinds, and buries those who don't belong. But Tom Horn belonged. He could ride for days without water. He could sleep on hard ground and wake up sharp. He could read the land like a book, every broken twig, every faint print in the sand. The Army called him a scout, but to the Apaches, he was a ghost. In the late 1870s, the Apache Wars were raging across the Southwest. It was a brutal, endless conflict, one side fighting for freedom, the other for control. The U.S. Army needed men who could survive the desert, who could track warriors through miles of sun and stone. Tom Horn was exactly that kind of man. He joined the campaign under General George Crook, one of the toughest and most respected officers in the frontier. Crook didn't care much for fancy soldiers. He wanted men who could get the job done, and Horn could. Most scouts broke after a few weeks in Apache country. The heat alone could drive a man mad. But not Horn. He learned how the Apache moved, quiet, patient, almost invisible. He learned to think like them, to predict where they'd strike, when they'd vanish, and how to follow their trails through canyons that swallowed whole armies. At night, he sat by the fire polishing his rifle, saying little. He wasn't a man of words. He was a man of results, and soon even the veterans noticed. Tom Horn, one officer wrote, could smell an Apache before he saw one. It wasn't far from the truth. His greatest test came in 1885, when the Army went after Geronimo, the most feared Apache leader of them all. Geronimo had escaped from a reservation and led a band of warriors back into the mountains. He was clever, fast, and ruthless. Entire units chased him and never came close. Then they sent Tom Horn. Horn tracked Geronimo for weeks through the Sierra Madre Mountains, a deadly maze of cliffs, caves, and hidden trails. He followed faint footprints, ashes from small fires, and bits of cloth left behind in the brush. He never gave up, even when food ran out, even when other scouts quit. Finally, his persistence paid off. Horn helped locate Geronimo's camp, and the Army closed in. When the great Apache leader finally surrendered, Tom Horn was there. He wasn't the man who caught Geronimo, but he was one of the men who made it possible. It should have been the proudest moment of his life. But when Horn looked at Geronimo, tired, proud, and beaten, he didn't feel victory. He felt something else, maybe guilt, maybe respect, because Horn understood men like Geronimo. They were fighters, survivors. They lived by their own law, just like he did. He once said later in life, "The Apaches were the best fighters I ever knew. If I had been born one of them, I'd never have surrendered either." Those words said everything about him. After the surrender, the Army praised Horn. He'd done his job, and he'd done it well. But when peace came, he felt lost. The war was over. The scouts were no longer needed. The world was changing. Horn left the Army service with a few dollars in his pocket and a lifetime's worth of hard lessons. He had learned that justice wasn't black and white. It was gray, dusty, and soaked in blood. He had learned that men followed orders not because they were right, but because someone told them to. And most of all, he had learned that the only person you could truly trust was yourself. He drifted north after that, to Colorado, Montana, and Wyoming, taking whatever work he could find. He broke wild horses for ranchers. He scouted for survey teams. He carried mail through snow and rain, but trouble seemed to follow him. Horn had a way of being both admired and feared. He was quiet, polite, and efficient, but there was something behind his calmness, something dangerous. People said he was fearless, but that wasn't true. He was just used to danger. When someone once asked him what it felt like to be shot at, Horn shrugged and said, "Feels the same as rain. You get used to it." That was Tom Horn, calm in chaos, steady as stone. By the late 1880s, Horn's name was spreading. Soldiers remembered him. Cattlemen hired him. Outlaws avoided him. He was the man who could track anyone, anywhere. The man who could kill if he had to, and never miss. And yet, deep inside, Horn was restless. He'd seen what the world did to men who followed orders too long. He didn't want to be someone's soldier anymore. He wanted to choose his own fights. The West was calling him again, but this time it wasn't for glory. It was for survival, because in the years ahead, Tom Horn wouldn't be hunting Apaches. He'd be hunting men. The war was over. The deserts were quiet, and Tom Horn, the man who could track anyone across 1,000 miles, suddenly had no one left to hunt. He was in his 20s now, lean and strong, with the hard look of a man who'd seen too much. The frontier was changing fast. Railroads cut through old trails. Towns were rising where camps once stood. The wild land was slowly being tamed, but there were still plenty of men who refused to follow. Rules, outlaws, rustlers, bandits, and the men who chased them. Lawmen and detectives. That's where Tom Horn came in. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency was the most feared private police force in America. They hunted killers, robbers, and train thieves across the country. Their motto was simple: we never sleep. In the late 1880s, Horn walked into one of their offices and asked for a job. He didn't have fancy letters or schooling, but when he told them he could track a man through desert sand or mountain snow, they believed him. He was hired almost on the spot. At first, Horn worked with other Pinkerton agents, tracking fugitives in Colorado and Wyoming. He studied the way they investigated, how they questioned witnesses, followed clues, and wrote reports. But Tom Horn wasn't built for paperwork. He wasn't the kind to wait for evidence or warrants. When Horn tracked someone, he didn't just find them. He stopped them. Sometimes that meant the man came back alive. Sometimes he didn't. The Pinkertons valued results, and Horn delivered. He caught stage robbers and horse thieves, tracked down killers hiding in the mountains, and brought justice to places where sheriffs were too scared to go. But Horn's methods were different. He didn't talk much, and he didn't ask for help. When he went after a suspect, he went alone. He'd ride out in silence, find the man, and come back, quiet as ever. Some agents said he was fearless. Others said he was cold. One report from the time described him as efficient but extreme. That was putting it lightly. Horn believed in justice, but his kind of justice. To him, right and wrong weren't decided by judges or juries. They were decided by what a man deserved. If a man stole, Horn thought he should be punished. If he killed, Horn believed he should die. Simple, direct, final. But the world wasn't that simple anymore. The law was changing, and the Pinkertons, though tough, still had rules. Rules that Horn couldn't follow. In one case, he was sent to arrest a killer hiding near the Colorado border. Horn tracked the man for 3 days alone. When he caught up, the outlaw pulled a gun. Horn pulled faster. The man never made it to court. When Horn brought back the news, his superior frowned. "You were supposed to bring him in," the man said. Horn's reply was quiet. He wasn't coming in. That was Tom Horn in a sentence, calm, unbothered, certain. He didn't see shades of gray. He saw threats and justice, and nothing in between. The Pinkertons began to worry. Horn's results were good, but his style was too rough for the agency's growing reputation. They were becoming professional, investigators, not executioners. Tom Horn belonged to an older time when justice came fast and from the barrel of a gun. By 1890, they let him go. They didn't fire him outright. They just stopped calling him for jobs. No hard feelings, no farewell, just silence. Horn didn't complain. He'd never been good at taking orders anyway, but outside the agency, his reputation only grew. Word spread that there was a man who could track you anywhere, who could shoot straighter than anyone, who never missed his mark. Ranchers started calling. Wyoming was in chaos. Cattle barons were at war with small ranchers and settlers. Herds were being stolen, fences cut, and cowboys murdered in the dark. The rich men of the West wanted someone who could protect their property, someone who didn't need laws or permission. They wanted Tom Horn. For Horn, it was perfect. No bosses, no paperwork, no limits, just the open range and his own code of justice. He took the job as a range detective, but everyone knew what that really meant. When cattle were stolen, he found the thieves. And when he found them, they didn't always live long enough to explain themselves. Some called him a hero, a man cleaning up the frontier. Others called him a killer for hire. Both were right. Tom Horn had crossed a line. He wasn't a soldier anymore. He wasn't a detective either. He was something else, something that didn't have a name. He rode for the powerful and dealt death for a price. And in his mind, it wasn't murder. It was justice, fast, clean, and final. But the world around him was changing fast. The open range was closing. Towns were growing. The law was spreading. And sooner or later, the same justice he dealt to others would come for him. By the early 1890s, the Old West was at war with itself. Cattle barons fought against small ranchers. Cowboys turned into rustlers, and rustlers turned into corpses. It wasn't about justice anymore. It was about survival, and that's where Tom Horn came in. He had the skills, the nerve, and the reputation. Everyone knew he could track a man through miles of wilderness and never lose him. Everyone knew he could shoot straight, and wouldn't hesitate to do it. When the law failed, people called for Tom Horn. He didn't wear a badge now. He didn't answer to a boss. He answered only to the job. Horn began working as a range detective for big cattle outfits across Wyoming and Colorado. That title sounded clean, official, like something out of a newspaper. But everyone knew what it really meant. He was a hired gun. If cattle were stolen, he found the thieves. If fences were cut, he tracked down the men who did it. And when he found them, the problem usually disappeared. No one asked how. No one wanted to know. Because the truth was simple. Tom Horn got results. The cattle barons loved him. He made them feel safe. Rustlers feared him. His name alone was enough to send men running for the state line. They said Horn could spot a rustler by the way he rode. They said he could hit a target at 300 yards without missing. But what really made him dangerous wasn't his aim. It was his calmness. He didn't enjoy killing. He just accepted it. In his mind, it was part of the job. "I never killed a man who didn't need killing," he was rumored to have said. That line became his legend. It made him sound like justice itself, cold, fast, and final. But not everyone saw it that way. The West was changing. More settlers were arriving. Towns were growing, bringing schools, churches, and laws. People didn't want gunmen deciding who lived and who died anymore. They wanted sheriffs and courts. And in this new world, men like Tom Horn were becoming outlaws, even if they still thought they were doing right. One winter in Wyoming, Horn was hired to investigate cattle thefts for the Swan Land and Cattle Company, one of the biggest ranches in the territory. The Swan Company had lost hundreds of head to small ranchers and rustlers who fenced in land that wasn't theirs. Horn rode out alone. Within weeks, the stealing stopped. No one saw what he did. No one found the bodies. But everyone got the message. Soon, other ranchers wanted the same results. And Horn became the most feared man in Wyoming. He rode from town to town, quiet, polite, but distant. He drank whiskey, played cards, and never talked about his work. People said that when Tom Horn looked at you, he could see the truth, whether you were a thief or not. Maybe it was just a story, but no one wanted to test it. The strange thing was, Horn didn't act like a killer. He was friendly with children, generous with his pay, and loyal to his friends. He even laughed easily, but his laugh never reached his eyes. He lived alone, mostly in camps or small cabins. No family, no wife, no letters home, just his horse, his rifle, and the open land. He once told a ranch hand, "A man's only got room for one thing in this life, his work. Mine just happens to be killing." He said it without pride, without shame, just fact. By now, the newspapers had started to take notice. They wrote about mysterious shootings, about rustlers who vanished, about a range detective who always seemed nearby. The name Tom Horn began to sound like a warning. Parents told their sons not to steal cattle. Not because it was wrong, but because Tom Horn might find them. He was becoming something bigger than a man, a myth, a shadow in a cowboy hat. But the line between hero and villain is thin. And Horn was walking it blind. The more men he killed, the easier it became. The easier it became, the more the world began to see him not as a protector, but as a monster. And the men who had once paid him, the rich cattle barons, started to whisper behind his back. They liked what he did, but not what he represented. He was a reminder of the bloody way they'd built their empires. Sooner or later, that kind of man becomes a problem. But Tom Horn didn't see it. He kept riding, kept taking jobs, kept living by the same rule he always had: justice at the end of a rifle. He believed he was doing good, that the world needed men like him. That order was worth killing for. But deep down, the Old West was dying. And when a world dies, it takes its legends with it. The day was coming when Tom Horn would meet his own kind of justice, and for the first time, he wouldn't be the one holding the gun. There are men who make history and men who become it. Tom Horn was both. By the mid-1890s, his name was known from Texas to Montana. To some, he was the bravest man alive. To others, he was the devil on horseback. But one thing everyone agreed on: you didn't cross Tom Horn. He rode alone, like a shadow with a badge that nobody had given him. The cattle barons called him when the law failed. He arrived quiet, stayed a few days, and then left. And somehow the rustlers were gone. No one saw it happen. No one ever did. But the story spread faster than dust in a storm. People said Horn could shoot the wings off a bird in mid-flight. They said he once tracked a thief for 50 miles through a blizzard and shot him dead with one bullet. The stories kept growing, and soon they turned into legend. The thing about legends, though, they don't tell the whole truth. Tom Horn wasn't a monster. He didn't kill for sport. He killed because, in his mind, that was the only language the West understood. He had lived through war, betrayal, and chaos. He had seen courts fail and sheriffs run. He didn't trust laws written by men who'd never held a rifle. Horn believed the West had its own rules. Hard rules. Rules that couldn't be changed by words or papers, only by lead. And that's when he said the line that would outlive him. I never killed a man who didn't need killing. Simple, cold, final. That one sentence made him immortal. It turned him from a man into a myth. People whispered it in saloons, told it around campfires, repeated it in fear and awe. Even the men who hated him couldn't stop talking about it. But what few understood was this: to Tom Horn, it wasn't a threat. It was a code. He believed he was doing what the law couldn't, that he was bringing order to a wild land one bullet at a time. He didn't see himself as an outlaw. He saw himself as the last law that mattered. In those years, Horn drifted from job to job: Wyoming, Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona. Wherever there was trouble, he appeared. Wherever he appeared, people stopped stealing. Ranchers paid him well. They'd hand him an envelope full of money and tell him where the rustlers were. No questions asked, no written contracts, just trust or fear. Horn's justice came quick and quiet. And for a while it worked, but the world was changing faster than he was. The telegraph was coming. Railroads stretched across the plains. Courthouses and jails were being built where Gallows once stood, and men like Tom Horn didn't fit in anymore. He still tried to keep up with the times. He worked for the U.S. government as a cattle inspector, for the Swan Land and Cattle Company as a detective, and even for the U.S. Marshal's office when they needed a tracker. But no matter what title he carried, people saw him for what he was: a killer who didn't need permission. There was something about him that made even brave men uneasy. He was polite, soft-spoken, even charming, but his eyes told a different story. They were the eyes of a man who had seen death too often to fear it. He lived by a simple rhythm: ride, find, kill, move on. Sometimes, though, the line between guilty and innocent blurred. Rumors spread that Horn had shot men who weren't thieves at all. Men caught in the wrong place, at the wrong time. But by then, no one dared question him. He was too powerful, too feared, too useful. The cattle kings turned a blind eye, and the law looked the other way. After all, the land was quiet, and that's all that mattered. But deep down, Horn was changing too. He was getting older, slower, and maybe just a little tired. The world he'd helped build, the one ruled by gunsmoke and grit, was being replaced by lawyers, judges, and telephones. And while he kept saying he didn't care, a part of him must have known the truth. His kind of justice was dying. And when justice dies, so do the men who live by it. Still, Horn kept riding. He told himself the same thing every time he pulled the trigger: that the man in his sights needed killing. It was his prayer, his excuse, his curse. Each shot made him more famous and more alone. He had become the very thing he once fought, a ghost haunting the land he claimed to protect. And the next time a rifle fired in Wyoming, the world would stop whispering his legend and start judging it, because the next man to die was just a boy. The summer of 1901 began like any other in the Wyoming hills: hot days, dry wind, and the sound of cattle moving across the land. But by the time it ended, a boy was dead, and the legend of Tom Horn was on trial. It started near Iron Mountain, a lonely stretch of country north of Cheyenne. The land was beautiful, open and wild, but it was also divided. Cattle ranchers and sheep herders had been fighting for years. The cattlemen claimed the sheep ruined the grass. The sheep herders claimed the cattlemen acted like they owned the world. In the middle of that fight stood one family, the Nichols. They raised sheep on land that the big cattle companies wanted, and they refused to leave. That made them a target. On the morning of July 18, 1901, 14-year-old Willie Nichol went out on horseback to check the family's sheep. He was just a boy, skinny, curious, and full of life. He wore his father's old hat and carried no weapon, just a simple riding stick. He never came home. A neighbor found his body hours later. He'd been shot in the back, one clean bullet through the chest. His horse was still grazing nearby. The news spread fast. The Nichols were heartbroken. The town was outraged, and the cattlemen stayed quiet. Everyone knew what the killing meant. It wasn't a robbery. It wasn't random. It was a message. Whispers began immediately. People said it was the work of a range detective, someone hired by the cattle barons to make examples of troublemakers. And when they said range detective, everyone thought of one name, Tom Horn. He'd been working in the area for the Swanland and Cattle Company, investigating livestock thefts. He was known to be nearby around the time Willie was shot. He was known to hate sheep ranchers. And he was known for one thing, getting results. But there was no proof. No one saw him. No one heard him. Just a dead boy, a silent rifle, and a legend with too many ghosts already behind him. A few weeks later, a deputy U.S. Marshal named Joe Liefers came looking for Tom Horn. Liefers was clever, and he knew Horn's pride was both his strength and his weakness. He invited Horn to Cheyenne for a drink. They sat together, shared whiskey, and talked about work, horses, and women. LaForce pretended to admire him, saying things like, "You've always been the best shot in Wyoming, Tom." Horn smiled. He liked being respected. Then LaForce brought up the murder. He asked casually what Horn thought about the Nichol boy. And that's when Tom Horn made the mistake that would hang him. According to Liefers, Horn leaned back in his chair, took a sip of whiskey, and said, "Yes, it was the best shot I ever made, and the dirtiest trick I ever done. Killed him at 300 yards. Didn't know it was a boy till afterward." The words hit like a gunshot. Was it a confession? Or just a drunken boast from a man who'd lived his life on stories and pride? LaForce wrote it down, told the authorities, and suddenly Tom Horn was the prime suspect in the murder of Willie Nichol. When they came to arrest him, Horn didn't fight. He was calm, polite, even joked with the deputies. He believed it would blow over. He had friends in high places, ranchers, sheriffs, and old comrades from the army. He thought they'd protect him. But he was wrong. The world had changed. The same people who once needed killers were now pretending they never knew them. The cattle barons had traded gunmen for lawyers, and they didn't want their names in the papers. Tom Horn was on his own. At his trial, the evidence was thin. There were no witnesses, no weapon, no clear motive. Only the so-called confession, words spoken over whiskey, recorded by a man with reasons to lie. But the jury didn't see a lack of proof. They saw a man who fit the story, a man with a reputation, a man who had killed before. To them, it didn't matter if he pulled the trigger that day. They believed he could have, and that was enough. Tom Horn sat in his cell reading newspapers about himself. Some called him a monster, some called him a martyr. He wrote letters to friends saying he'd been framed. He told one reporter, "If I had really shot that boy, there wouldn't be a man alive to prove it." He smiled when he said it. But behind that smile was something else. Maybe pride, maybe sorrow, maybe both. The trial of Tom Horn wasn't really about one man. It was about an entire era. The Old West, with its gunfighters, vigilantes, and frontier justice, was ending. The New World wanted order, laws, and accountability. Someone had to pay for the sins of the past, and Tom Horn, the last ghost of that dying world, was an easy sacrifice. The story of Tom Horn was always about one thing: control. He spent his life tracking others, judging them, deciding who lived and who died. But now, for the first time, the hunter was the hunted, and this time the trap wasn't set in the open range. It was built out of lies, whiskey, and words. After his arrest for the murder of young Willie Nickel, Tom Horn was taken to Cheyenne, the capital of Wyoming. The people there were split. Some still saw him as a hero, a man who had cleaned up the West. Others saw him as proof that justice had been missing for far too long. But the law had a problem. They had no real evidence, no witness, no rifle, no clear motive. All they had was Joe Leifer's story, a conversation over drinks. One man's word against another's, and that wasn't enough to hang a legend. So the prosecution needed to make Horn's words sound like the truth. And they needed the public to believe it. Tom Horn's confession became front-page news. Reporters wrote that he had bragged about killing the Nickel boy from 300 yards away, calling it the best shot I ever made. They printed it as fact, even though no one else had heard it. But the newspapers weren't chasing truth. They were chasing headlines. Tom Horn was famous, dangerous, and mysterious. He was everything readers wanted. Soon the whole country was watching. And Tom Horn, sitting in his jail cell, was becoming less of a man and more of a story. At first, he didn't take it seriously. He'd been questioned before, threatened before. He believed someone would come forward, someone powerful, to get him out. After all, he'd done the dirty work for some of the richest men in Wyoming. He'd protected their herds, guarded their money, and kept their secrets. Surely they wouldn't let him hang. But when the letters stopped coming, and the visitors stopped visiting, Tom Horn began to understand the truth. The cattle barons didn't need him anymore. The world had changed, and men like Tom Horn were bad for business. His trial began in October 1902. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, townsfolk, farmers, and ranchers filled every seat. The prosecution painted Horn as a cold-blooded killer, a hired assassin who had spent years shooting men for money. They didn't have proof of this killing, but they had plenty of stories about others. Every witness, every whisper, every rumor was used to turn legend into guilt. When LaForce took the stand, he spoke with confidence. He said Horn had confessed freely, even proudly. He described every word, every drink, every pause. Horn's lawyer tried to fight back, saying it was hearsay, a setup. But the jury didn't see a setup. They saw the ghost of the Old West sitting in front of them, and they wanted that ghost gone. Tom Horn sat quietly during the trial. He didn't shout or plead. He looked the judge in the eye and listened. Sometimes he even smiled, as if the whole thing was happening to someone else. When asked if he wanted to speak, he said simply, "If I had killed that boy, there'd be no evidence left to find." The courtroom went silent. It was the wrong answer, clever, cold, and proud. It made the jury's decision easy. The verdict came on October 24th, 1902, guilty of first-degree murder. Sentence: death by hanging. Horn nodded once calmly, as if it didn't matter. He even shook the prosecutor's hand. Outside, reporters shouted questions. One asked, "Tom, are you afraid to die?" Horn smiled. "No," he said. "There's been too much killing in this world already. One more won't matter." That quote ran in every paper in America. It made him sound brave and doomed. In jail, Horn waited for the governor to grant him a pardon or a new trial. He wrote letters, read books, and even built toys for children who visited the jailhouse. He was quiet, polite, and still confident that justice, the kind he believed in, would save him. But justice wasn't on his side anymore. Not the kind written in law books. The same people who once hired him were now silent. The cattlemen didn't testify. The politicians looked away. Tom Horn had become a symbol, not of law and order, but of the violence America wanted to forget. The date of his execution was set for November 20th, 1903, one day before his 43rd birthday. When he heard, Horn didn't curse or cry. He just nodded and said, "That'll be my birthday present then." He even helped build the scaffold that would hang him. He tested the trapdoor himself, made sure it would work cleanly. The man who had spent his life pulling triggers was now helping build the trigger that would end him. And still, he never said he killed the boy. November 20th, 1903, Cheyenne, Wyoming. The morning air was cold and still. Frost covered the wooden beams of the gallows, and a quiet crowd gathered in the courtyard of the Laramie County Jail. It was the end of an era. The Old West, wild, bloody, and untamed, was about to hang with one man. That man was Tom Horn. He had spent over a year in his cell waiting for this day. Most men in his place would have broken down, begging, praying, or cursing the world that betrayed them. But not Tom Horn. He spent his last months reading newspapers, writing letters and talking with guards. He was polite, even friendly. He made toys for the jailer's children. He told stories about the Apache Wars, the cattle trails, and the old days when the West still belonged to men like him. He never spoke much about the murder of Willie Nickel. When people asked, he only said, "I didn't kill that boy, but I know who did." And then he'd smile and change the subject. Reporters came from all over the country to see him, to meet the man who'd lived like a gun and was now waiting for the hammer to fall. They expected anger or regret. Instead, they found calm. One journalist wrote, "He faced death as if it were just another sunrise." Horn didn't see himself as a victim. He saw himself as finished, a man who had played his part in the great story of the West. On the morning of his execution, Horn woke early. He shaved, dressed neatly, and put on his best clothes, a dark coat, a white shirt, and a black hat. When the sheriff came to get him, Horn smiled and said, "I suppose it's time for me to get up." He walked to the gallows without chains. He didn't need them. There was no fight left in him. Every step echoed on the wooden boards. Every eye in the crowd followed him, some with pity, some with hate, some with admiration. He reached the platform and looked out over the crowd. The sky was gray, the air sharp. In the distance, the wind moved through the grass, the same wind that had once carried his name across the plains. The priest offered him prayer. Horn shook his head gently. "I've made my peace," he said. "God knows the truth." Then he looked at the sheriff. "Ain't losing my nerve now." "Boys." Those were his last words. They tied his hands behind his back, placed the rope around his neck, and pulled the black hood over his face. The crowd went silent. Then the trapdoor opened, and Tom Horn dropped through, swinging gently in the cold Wyoming air. It was over in seconds, just like every killing he had ever done, quick, clean, final. They buried him quietly in the Colonia, Missouri cemetery, back near the place where he was born. No family attended, only a few old cowboys sent flowers. His grave was simple, just a wooden cross with his name carved in rough letters. But his story didn't stay buried. In the years that followed, people kept talking about him. Some said he was guilty, that he finally got what he deserved. Others said he was framed, that powerful men used him and then threw him away. Historians argued. Writers romanticized him. Movies turned him into a tragic hero, the last cowboy of a dying age. But one truth always remained. Tom Horn's death marked the end of something bigger than one man. It was the death of the old code, the code of the gun, the code that said a man could be judge, jury, and executioner all by himself. The world that replaced it was safer, cleaner, and maybe fairer, but never as wild. Years later, one old rancher who had known Horn said, "Tom was the best man I ever rode with, but he was born 50 years too late. Maybe that's what killed him in the end. Not the rope, not the law, but time itself." Tom Horn was a bridge between two worlds, the wild and the civilized, the free and the bound. And when the world changed, he couldn't change with it. He lived by the gun. He died by the law. And he became a ghost, riding forever on the wind that still whispers his name. The year was 1903 when Tom Horn's body dropped through the gallows floor in Cheyenne. But his story never hit the ground. It drifted like smoke across the plains he once rode, across Wyoming, across history, across time itself, because legends don't die. They just change shape. After Horn's death, people couldn't stop talking about him. Newspapers argued whether he was a hero or a murderer. Some called him a cowboy, assassin. Others called him the last honest man in a crooked world. But nobody, not one person, could ignore him. Even the men who condemned him found themselves haunted by what they'd done. They'd killed Tom Horn, but they couldn't kill what he stood for. That hard, dangerous idea of frontier justice. In the years that followed, his grave became a place of quiet pilgrimage. Old cowboys came to visit, hat in hand, muttering that he'd been framed, that he took the fall for the powerful ranchers who once paid him to do their dirty work. They said the rich needed someone to blame for the violence of the past, and Tom Horn, fearless, proud, and alone, was the perfect man for it. Whether that's true or not, nobody can say for sure. The records are thin, The evidence is gone. The truth, like everything about Tom Horn, is buried somewhere between the lines of fact and legend. But his story didn't stay in the history books. It grew, told in bars, in campfires, in stories passed down through families. In the 1930s and 40s, Western writers turned him into a tragic hero, a man who lived by a code too rough for the world that replaced him. In the 1970s, Hollywood brought him back again. Actor Steve McQueen played him in the movie Tom Horn, quiet, steady, doomed. The same way he'd lived, the film showed what history had forgotten, that maybe Tom Horn wasn't evil. Maybe he was just born in the wrong century. Historians still argue over what really happened to Willie Nickel. Some believe Horn did it, some swear he was set up. In 1993, nearly 90 years after his hanging, a group of researchers even held a mock retrial, using modern law, modern rules, and the same old evidence. The result? Not guilty. The jury said there was too much doubt, too little proof, too much pride and politics in the original case. But even that didn't settle it. Because Tom Horn's story isn't about proof. It's about belief. To some, he's a symbol of everything dark about the frontier, a man who lived by violence and paid the price. To others, he's the last cowboy, a man who stood for justice when the law was weak, and who died because he refused to change. Either way, he became something larger than life, the outlaw who believed he was the law, the killer who thought he was saving people, the soldier, the scout, the detective, the gun for hire, and finally the ghost. Today, if you drive through Wyoming and stop in the right place, maybe on a dusty road near Iron Mountain, or out where the wind never stops blowing, you'll hear the name again. Tom Horn. Some say you can still see his figure on the ridges at sunset, a lone rider watching over the land he once tried to protect. Others say it's just the wind, the same wind that carried his legend for more than a century. But maybe, just maybe, it's something more. Maybe it's a reminder that justice is never simple, that good and evil often wear the same hat, that sometimes a man becomes the very thing he's trying to fight. Tom Horn's story isn't just about the Old West. It's about all of us, about pride, power, and the price of living by your own rules. He once said he never killed a man who didn't need killing. Maybe he believed that until the very end. Or maybe, in those last quiet moments on the gallows, he finally realized what every legend learns too late, that no one, not even justice itself, can outrun the truth forever. Over 100 years later, his name still rides on the wind, whispered in stories, printed in books, etched into the myth of the American frontier, because Tom Horn wasn't just a man. He was a question, one that still doesn't have an answer. Was he a hero? A killer? Or just a man trying to survive in a world that changed too fast? No one knows for sure, and maybe that's why his legend lives on.